Malcolm, a shy, brilliant student, faces daily ridicule from his classmates for being different. But when Jason and Ethan, the very students who tormented him, need his help to pass a crucial exam, they find themselves questioning their own biases. As they work together, long-buried prejudices resurface, and the consequences of their past behavior come back to haunt them. Will their newfound understanding be enough to overcome the rumors and whispers of cheating that threaten to undo everything they've worked for? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Malcolm Davis was a shadow at school. He moved through the hallways, head down, invisible to most, except when his quiet brilliance forced others to take notice. He was tall for his age, but somehow still managed to shrink into himself, keeping his presence to a minimum. His classmates, lost in the swirl of their own teenage dramas, rarely spared him a second glance, unless, of course, it was to make a snide comment or throw a sideways insult his way. It wasn't that Malcolm minded the solitude. He had grown used to it. He was at peace in his world of books, math problems, and ideas that seemed to soar far beyond the confines of his classroom. But there was a subtle ache that came with being ignored, a sting that came with the jabs of his classmates, even if he never showed it on the surface. In class, Malcolm's intelligence couldn't be ignored, even by the teachers who tried to maintain an even hand with all their students. His answers were always sharp, precise, and delivered with a quiet confidence that few his age could muster. Mr. Stevens, his math teacher, often called on him during the toughest parts of the lesson, knowing Malcolm would solve whatever problem was thrown his way. But this only made Malcolm more of a target for his classmates. Jason, Ethan, and their group of friends were particularly relentless. Jason was the type of student who thrived on being popular, charismatic, and in control of the social dynamics at school. His constant joking and mocking were part of his charm. At least, that's how his friends saw it. And Ethan, Jason's loyal follower, never missed an opportunity to back him up. One afternoon, after Malcolm had answered yet another challenging math question with ease, Jason couldn't resist. As the class filed out of the room, he made sure his voice was loud enough for Malcolm to hear. "Bet Malcolm's gonna be the next Einstein or something," Jason sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe he can tutor us all when we fail the final." Ethan laughed, adding, "Yeah, if he's not too busy building a rocket ship or whatever it is nerds like him do." Malcolm didn't respond. He had learned a long time ago that responding only made things worse. Instead, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and left the classroom, his face a mask of indifference. But inside, the words stung more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the insults. It was the way they dismissed him as if he were nothing more than a curiosity. Someone to mock, not understand. That night, as Malcolm sat at the dinner table with his mother, he tried to shake off the day's events. His mother, Mrs. Davis, was his rock, always encouraging him to keep his head up, to rise above the negativity. She had worked hard to give Malcolm a good life, raising him on her own after his father passed away when he was young. She was proud of her son's academic achievements, always reminding him that his intelligence was a gift. "How was school today, sweetie?" she asked, setting a plate of food in front of him. "Same as usual," Malcolm muttered, picking at his dinner. "Nothing new?" Mrs. Davis gave him a knowing look, the kind that only a mother could give. "You know, Malcolm, you can always talk to me about what's going on. I know things haven't been easy for you at school." Malcolm shrugged, not wanting to burden his mother with his problems. "It's fine, Mom. I'm just focused on getting through the year and doing well on the exams." She sat down beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "You're stronger than you think, Malcolm. And you're not alone, even if it feels that way sometimes." Malcolm nodded, though the weight of the day still lingered on his shoulders. He knew his mother was right, but it didn't make the teasing any easier to endure. He wished he could ignore it, but the words always found a way to burrow into his mind, making him question if he truly belonged. The final exam was fast approaching, and with it came a palpable sense of anxiety among the students. The weight of its importance loomed over them all, especially for those who had been struggling to keep up. Malcolm, on the other hand, felt prepared. He had studied diligently, as always, and knew the material inside and out. But the same couldn't be said for Jason, Ethan, and their friends. In the days leading up to the exam, the mood at school shifted. Conversations turned to panic, and even the usually laid-back Jason seemed on edge. Malcolm could hear the murmurs as he walked through the hallways, snippets of conversations about how difficult the exam would be, and how little time was left to catch up. In the back of his mind, Malcolm knew what was coming. He had seen it before, the way students would suddenly change their tune when they needed something. But he hadn't expected it to come from Jason and Ethan. Not after all the teasing and ridicule. The moment came after class one afternoon. Malcolm was gathering his things when he noticed Jason and Ethan lingering by the door, exchanging nervous glances. It was clear they were trying to work up the courage to approach him. Malcolm braced himself, expecting another sarcastic comment or jab. But instead, Jason's voice was hesitant, unsure. Malcolm?" Jason started, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "Can we, talk for a sec?" Malcolm glanced up, his expression unreadable. "What's up?" Jason shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his element. We were wondering, since you're really good at this math stuff, if you could, help us out with the final?" Ethan quickly chimed in, his usual bravado gone. "Yeah, man, we're really struggling. We don't want to fail, and, we know you're the best at this." Malcolm felt a swirl of emotions, surprise, suspicion, and a flicker of satisfaction. The same people who had mocked him for being a nerd were now coming to him for help. He had every right to say no, to walk away and let them face the consequences of their own actions. But something held him back. "I'll think about it," Malcolm said quietly, slipping his backpack over his shoulder. Jason and Ethan exchanged relieved glances. "Thanks, man," Jason said, his voice full of gratitude. "We really appreciate it." As Malcolm walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if this was an opportunity for something more. Could helping them lead to something better? Could it change the way they saw him? That night, as he lay in bed, Malcolm thought about what his mother had said. Maybe this was a chance to rise above, to show them a side of him they had never bothered to see. But could he trust them? Could he really believe they would change? Malcolm stared up at the ceiling, unsure of what the future held. But one thing was certain, the final exam wasn't the only test looming ahead. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual chaos of lunch period, but Malcolm sat at his usual spot, quietly working through his homework as the noise swirled around him. He didn't mind the noise, it was almost comforting in a way. It gave him a reason to stay focused on his work, to avoid the awkwardness of sitting alone while the rest of the school carried on around him. Jason and Ethan, along with their group of friends, were at the opposite end of the room, laughing and talking loudly, as they always did. It amazed Malcolm how easily they could ignore the growing pressure of the final exam. Even as the exam loomed over their heads, they carried on like nothing was wrong. But Malcolm knew better. He had seen the way they'd glanced nervously at each other in class, the way they'd fumbled through Mr. Stevens' review questions. Their confidence was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before the reality of their situation caught up with them. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Jason and Ethan made their move. As the lunch period was winding down, Malcolm noticed them walking toward him, their usual swagger noticeably absent. They stopped in front of his table, and for a moment, Malcolm thought they might change their minds and turn back. But Jason cleared his throat, and Malcolm looked up from his notebook, surprised to see genuine nervousness on his face. "Hey, Malcolm," Jason began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. He glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. We were wondering if you could help us with something." Malcolm's heart raced. He knew exactly what this was about. The final exam was just days away, and Jason and Ethan were clearly out of their depth. They had spent the entire semester coasting by, not paying attention, relying on charm and popularity to get them through. But now, with the final exam standing between them and failure, they had no choice but to face the reality of their academic situation. Malcolm closed his notebook and looked at them, his expression unreadable. "Help you with what?" Jason shifted awkwardly on his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The math final? We're really struggling, and, we know you're, really good at it. We thought maybe you could, tutor us or something." Malcolm stared at them, his mind racing. These were the same guys who had mocked him, made him feel small, and now they were asking him for help? The irony wasn't lost on him, and for a brief moment he considered turning them down, letting them deal with the consequences of their own actions. But something about the way they asked, Jason's hesitation, Ethan's nervous glance, made Malcolm pause. They weren't demanding his help like they were entitled to it. They were asking, almost pleading. Still, he wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. "You've spent the whole semester ignoring the work," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "Why should I help you now?" Jason and Ethan exchanged a quick glance, and for a moment, Malcolm thought they might lose their cool, revert back to the arrogance and attitude that had defined them for so long. But to his surprise, Jason took a deep breath and spoke again, this time with more sincerity. "Look, we know we messed up," Jason admitted, his tone softer. "We should have taken things more seriously, but we didn't, and now we're in over our heads. We don't want to fail, and we know you're the best person to help us." Malcolm studied their faces. He could see the desperation in their eyes, and for the first time, they seemed genuine. This wasn't just another act. They were scared. Scared of failing. Scared of what it would mean for their futures. It was a side of them Malcolm had never seen before, and it was hard not to feel a pang of sympathy. But still, Malcolm couldn't forget the way they had treated him. The teasing, the taunts, the casual cruelty that had followed him throughout the semester. He wasn't sure if he could trust them, even if they seemed sincere now. "I don't know," Malcolm said slowly, trying to buy himself some time to think. "It's a lot of work, and I've got my own studying to do. Why should I risk my time helping you guys?" Ethan, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke up. "We're not asking you to do all the work for us," he said quickly, his voice pleading. We need a little extra help to get us through. We're willing to put in the effort, we just don't know where to start." There was a moment of silence as Malcolm considered their words. He could see they were serious, but the hurt of their past behavior still lingered. His mind raced, weighing the decision. On one hand, helping them would be an act of kindness, a chance to prove he was better than the way they had treated him. On the other hand, it could backfire. What if they only pretended to change, only to go back to their old ways once they got what they wanted? "I'll think about it," Malcolm finally said, his voice steady. It was the safest answer he could give without committing himself fully. Jason and Ethan seemed to accept it, though their relief was palpable. "Thanks, man," Jason said, a small smile of gratitude flickering across his face. "We really appreciate it." As they walked away, Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, uncertainty, and a tiny spark of something else. Maybe it was the hope that this could be a turning point, not just for them, but for him too. He had spent so long being the outsider, the target of their jokes, that the thought of being seen differently was both terrifying and thrilling. That evening, Malcolm sat at his desk staring at his textbooks, but unable to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Jason and Ethan. His mother's words echoed in his head. "Kindness can change hearts, but it comes with risk." Was this one of those moments? Was this his chance to rise above the negativity, to show them that he wasn't just the quiet kid they had dismissed? Or was it just another opportunity for them to take advantage of him? The question gnawed at him as he tried to focus on his studies. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that this decision was more important than just helping them pass a test. It was about something bigger, about proving something to himself. The next day, Malcolm found himself standing in front of Jason and Ethan at the end of class. They had been waiting for him, hopeful expressions on their faces. Malcolm took a deep breath. He had made his decision. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "But we're going to do this my way. You're going to have to put in the work." Jason and Ethan nodded eagerly, their relief almost tangible. "We'll do whatever it takes," Jason promised. Malcolm wasn't sure if he believed them yet. But as he walked away, he felt a small sense of hope flicker inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. The library was quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional flip of a page and the soft murmur of students studying in clusters. The scent of old books mixed with the faint aroma of fresh coffee from the nearby cafe. It was the perfect place for studying, or at least, that's what Malcolm always thought. But today, the atmosphere felt different, heavier. He sat at a table in the back corner, his math textbook open in front of him, waiting for Jason and Ethan to show up. He still couldn't shake the weirdness of the whole situation. A week ago, he would have never imagined himself in this position, tutoring the same guys who had teased him relentlessly. But here he was, about to do just that. And even though he had agreed to help them, there was still a part of him that questioned if he'd made the right decision. When Jason and Ethan finally arrived, their usual cocky attitudes seemed muted. They looked anxious, almost out of place in the library, as if they didn't belong there. Jason gave Malcolm an awkward smile, and Ethan muttered a quick, "Hey," before they sat down. "All right," Malcolm began, keeping his voice neutral. "Let's get started. What areas are you struggling with?" Jason and Ethan exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to answer. It was obvious that they hadn't really thought about where their weaknesses lay. They were just hoping Malcolm could wave a magic wand and make everything better. But Malcolm wasn't about to let them off that easily. "We need to start with the basics," Malcolm said, flipping to the first section of the textbook. "You're not going to pass this exam if you don't understand the fundamentals." For the first hour, Malcolm walked them through the material, explaining concepts they should have learned weeks ago. Jason and Ethan listened quietly, taking notes, their usual banter absent. It was clear that they were out of their depth, but Malcolm was surprised at how hard they were trying to keep up. They weren't goofing off or making snide remarks, they were genuinely trying to understand. As the session went on, something strange started to happen. The awkwardness between them began to fade, replaced by a tentative sense of focus. Malcolm found himself slipping into the familiar role of a tutor, guiding them through the problems with patience and clarity. And Jason and Ethan, to their credit, didn't act like the bullies he remembered. They were respectful, asking questions when they didn't understand, and even thanking him when he explained something in a way that made sense to them. It wasn't long before Malcolm noticed a shift in their attitudes. Jason, who usually led the teasing, seemed almost humbled by the challenge in front of him. Ethan, who had always been Jason's sidekick, was quieter than usual, his concentration etched into his features. They were still far from mastering the material, but the effort they were putting in was real. At one point, Jason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Man, I had no idea how behind I was," he admitted, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "This stuff is way harder than I thought." Ethan nodded in agreement, flipping through his notes. "Yeah, I thought I could just wing it, but there's no way I would have passed without your help, Malcolm." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to hearing them speak like this, genuinely, without any of the bravado that usually masked their insecurities. For the first time, they were being honest, not just with him, but with themselves. And as much as he had resented them for their past behavior, Malcolm couldn't help but respect their vulnerability in this moment. "I'm not here to do the work for you," Malcolm reminded them, though his tone was softer now. "You've got to put in the time. This isn't something you can cram for." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "We know. We'll keep working on it." There was a brief pause, and then, unexpectedly, Jason spoke again, this time in a quieter voice. "Listen, Malcolm. I know we haven't exactly been nice to you before. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, man. We were jerks, and that wasn't cool." Malcolm blinked, caught off guard. He had expected some level of gratitude, maybe even respect for his tutoring. But an apology? That was something he hadn't anticipated. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. His immediate instinct was to brush it off, to protect himself from getting too close, but the sincerity in Jason's voice made him pause. Ethan chimed in, his voice quiet but earnest. "Yeah, we didn't really think about how our jokes might have hurt you. We were just messing around, but it wasn't right." Malcolm shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to this, being acknowledged, being apologized to. It was a strange feeling, one that stirred up emotions he had buried long ago. Part of him wanted to tell them that their apology didn't erase the months of teasing, the isolation he had felt, the way they had made him feel small. But another part of him, one that was tired of holding on to resentment, wondered if this was a chance to move on. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I appreciate the apology," Malcolm said slowly. "But it's not about what you say right now. It's about how you treat people moving forward. You can't just apologize and then go back to being the same person." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. We're trying to do better." Ethan glanced down at the table, his fingers tracing the edges of his notebook. "We really are, man. We've been jerks, but we're trying to change." Malcolm studied their faces, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all he saw was two guys who were trying to make amends. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt a flicker of hope that maybe things could be different. They continued studying for the rest of the afternoon, the tension between them slowly fading as they focused on the task at hand. Malcolm explained each concept patiently, and Jason and Ethan worked through the problems with surprising diligence. It was hard work, but it felt different now, less like an obligation and more like a shared effort. By the time they wrapped up, the sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the library floor. Jason and Ethan packed up their things, both looking more exhausted than when they had arrived, but there was also a sense of accomplishment in their expressions. "Thanks again, Malcolm," Jason said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "We'll keep working on this, I promise." Ethan gave Malcolm a nod, his voice soft but sincere. "Yeah, we really appreciate it." Malcolm watched them leave, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him still held on to the hurt from the past, but another part of him, one that had been quietly yearning for connection, felt lighter. The walls he had built around himself over the years were still there, but for the first time, there were cracks. Cracks that let in the possibility of something different. As he gathered his own things and left the library, Malcolm couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. He knew that things wouldn't change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for Jason and Ethan, but for him too. The day of the final exam arrived faster than any of them expected. The tension at school was palpable. Students shuffled nervously in the hallways, flipping through notebooks, trying to cram last-minute information into their heads. Malcolm sat quietly at his desk in the classroom, going over his mental checklist of formulas and strategies. He was ready. He had always been ready, but he couldn't help glancing over at Jason and Ethan, who were sitting a few rows away, looking unusually calm. The past few weeks had been different for them. Ever since Malcolm had started tutoring them, Jason and Ethan had transformed. It wasn't just about learning the material, it was about shedding the arrogance that had once defined them. They had put in the work, real work, Malcolm had to admit, and for the first time he saw something different in them. Respect. Not just for the material, but for him. Mr. Stevens entered the room, a stack of exams in his hands, and the class fell into an uneasy silence. He began handing out the tests, reminding them to do their best, as if the stakes weren't already clear. The final exam was everything. Those who failed would have to retake the class, potentially setting them back academically. For some, like Jason and Ethan, it was the difference between moving forward or being held back. Malcolm took a deep breath as the exam was placed in front of him. He flipped through the pages, skimming over the questions. As expected, it was difficult, but nothing he couldn't handle. His pencil moved across the paper, steady and sure, as he worked through each problem with a focus that blocked out the rest of the room. The minutes ticked by, and the sound of pencils scratching paper filled the air. Malcolm was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice Jason glancing over at him, a quick, almost imperceptible nod of appreciation flashing in his eyes. Jason and Ethan worked furiously, and Malcolm could see the tension in their movements. They were struggling, but they weren't giving up. For Malcolm, it was a strange feeling. There was no satisfaction in watching them struggle. Instead, he found himself silently rooting for them, hoping that all their hard work would pay off. Despite everything that had happened in the past, despite the way they had treated him, Malcolm wanted them to succeed. It wasn't about proving anything to them anymore. It was about proving something to himself. That kindness, even in the face of cruelty, could lead to something better. When the exam finally ended, the room erupted into a collective sigh of relief. Students handed in their papers, some looking confident, others looking defeated. Jason and Ethan looked exhausted but oddly hopeful as they handed in their exams and left the room. Malcolm lingered for a moment, collecting his things, when Mr. Stevens approached him. "Malcolm, can I speak with you for a moment?" Mr. Stevens asked, his voice low but kind. Malcolm nodded, slinging his backpack over his shoulder as the other students filed out of the room. Mr. Stevens waited until they were alone before speaking. "I just wanted to say," Mr. Stevens began, "I've noticed the changes in Jason and Ethan. They've been working a lot harder lately, and I have a feeling that's thanks to you." Malcolm shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not for something like this. "I just helped them study," he said, trying to downplay it. Mr. Stevens smiled. "It's more than that. You didn't have to help them, but you did. That says a lot about your character, Malcolm." Malcolm wasn't sure how to respond, so he just nodded, grateful when the conversation ended. As he walked out of the classroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not just in Jason and Ethan, but in himself. The results of the final exam were posted a week later, and the school was buzzing with anticipation. Students crowded around the bulletin board, eager to see their grades, while others hung back, too nervous to look. Malcolm waited patiently at the edge of the crowd, his heart steady. He wasn't worried about his own score, he knew he had done well, but he was curious about Jason and Ethan. When he finally made his way to the board, his eyes skimmed over the list of names. His own name was at the top, as expected, with the highest score in the class. But what caught his attention was Jason and Ethan's names. They had passed. Barely, but they had passed. A smile tugged at the corner of Malcolm's mouth. They had done it. All the hard work, all the late nights spent studying in the library had paid off. He was genuinely happy for them, and for a brief moment he felt a sense of pride, not just in himself, but in them. But that feeling didn't last long. As the students dispersed, Malcolm overheard whispers, rumors, sharp and biting, circulating through the hallways. They only passed because Malcolm probably gave them all the answers. I bet they didn't even do any of the work themselves. Typical. They just used him and took all the credit. Malcolm's stomach tightened. He had expected there to be some backlash. There always was when people succeeded in unexpected ways. But the rumors hit harder than he had anticipated. No one seemed to believe that Jason and Ethan had earned their passing grades. They dismissed it as manipulation, assuming that Malcolm had simply done all the work for them. Jason and Ethan, too, had heard the rumors. By lunchtime, it was clear that the whispers were starting to get to them. Malcolm noticed them sitting at their usual table, their faces dark with frustration. The casual confidence they once carried seemed to have vanished, replaced by a sense of defensiveness. Later that day, they caught up with Malcolm in the hallway. Jason's face was tight with anger, and Ethan looked equally upset. "Have you heard what people are saying?" Jason asked, his voice low but intense. "They think we only passed because you handed us the answers." Malcolm nodded, his own frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I heard." Ethan shook his head, disbelief clouding his expression. "We worked hard for this. It's not fair." "It's not," Malcolm agreed, feeling the weight of their frustration. He understood how it felt to be misunderstood, to have your efforts overlooked or dismissed because of assumptions people made about you. But before Malcolm could say anything else, Jason spoke again, his voice firm. "We can't just let them think that. We have to say something." Malcolm was taken aback. Jason, who had once been more concerned with his image than anything else, was now standing up not just for himself, but for Malcolm as well. It was a surprising shift, one that Malcolm hadn't expected. "What do you want to do?" Malcolm asked. Jason glanced at Ethan, who nodded in agreement. "We'll tell them the truth. We didn't pass because you did the work for us. You helped us, but we studied our butts off to make sure we earned it." Malcolm felt a swell of respect for them. It was one thing to apologize in private, but standing up in front of their peers and owning their mistakes and their successes was something else entirely. It took courage, the kind of courage Malcolm hadn't seen in them before. The next day, Jason and Ethan did exactly that. In front of their classmates, they acknowledged that they had been struggling, that they hadn't taken the class seriously for most of the semester, but that Malcolm had helped them turn things around. They didn't downplay Malcolm's role, but they made it clear that they had worked hard for their grades, that they had earned their success. The whispers didn't stop immediately, but they did begin to fade. People began to see Jason and Ethan in a new light, not as cheaters or manipulators, but as students who had faced their shortcomings and worked to overcome them. And Malcolm, though still wary, felt something shift inside him. A sense of peace, of resolution. As the semester came to an end, Malcolm found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had helped Jason and Ethan, but in doing so, he had learned something about himself as well. He had learned that kindness wasn't a weakness, that helping others didn't mean sacrificing his own worth. He had also learned that people could change, if given the chance. Jason and Ethan still had a long way to go, but Malcolm no longer saw them as his enemies. They were just people, flawed, like everyone else, trying to navigate a world that often judged too quickly, too harshly. And in helping them, Malcolm had found a kind of freedom from the hurt he had carried, freedom from the isolation he had once accepted as his only reality. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a start that left Malcolm feeling lighter, more hopeful, and more connected to the world around him. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the semester. The hallways were filled with the buzz of students celebrating the start of their break, conversations about summer plans, and the next stage of their high school journeys. But for Malcolm, Jason, and Ethan, this moment felt like the end of something much bigger. A chapter in their lives they hadn't expected to close, in the way that it did. Malcolm walked through the crowded hallways, his backpack slung over his shoulder, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. The weeks leading up to the final exam had been filled with uncertainty, frustration, and even some anger. But now, as he headed toward the exit, it all seemed like a distant memory. Jason and Ethan had followed through on their promise to stand up and speak the truth, and although the rumors had persisted for a while, things had slowly started to settle down. As Malcolm stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, he saw Jason and Ethan waiting near the school's front gate. They waved him over, and for a moment, Malcolm hesitated. He wasn't used to this, to being included, to being part of something larger than his own quiet world. But as he approached, he realized that things really had changed, not just between them, but for him as well. "Hey, Malcolm," Jason called, a wide grin on his face. "We were just talking about heading to the diner down the street to grab some food. You want to come?" Malcolm paused, his mind racing. A few months ago, he would have declined the offer without a second thought. He had spent years keeping his distance from people like Jason and Ethan, people who had hurt him, people who had judged him without ever trying to understand him. But now, things were different. They had apologized, they had changed, and, maybe most importantly, Malcolm had changed too. "Yeah," Malcolm said, smiling slightly. "I think I'll join you." The three of them walked together toward the diner, the air between them light and easy. They talked about the final exam, how hard it had been, how relieved they were that it was finally over, and for the first time Malcolm felt like he belonged. Not because he had changed who he was, but because Jason and Ethan had finally seen him for who he truly was. As they sat in the diner, eating burgers and fries, Jason leaned back in his seat, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Malcolm," he began, his tone more serious now, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened this semester, about how we treated you." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, surprised. They had already apologized, so he wasn't sure what more there was to say. But Jason continued, his voice filled with a kind of quiet reflection Malcolm hadn't heard from him before. I really didn't get it, you know? I never stopped to think about how our words, might have hurt you. We were just messing around, but I realize now that it was more than that. It was wrong." Ethan nodded, pushing his fries around on his plate. "Yeah, man. I feel the same way. We didn't take the time to know you, and we judged you based on, well, a lot of stuff that we didn't really understand." Malcolm listened in silence, unsure of how to respond. He had spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like no one really saw him for who he was, that hearing them acknowledge their mistakes felt both surreal and relieving. It wasn't that their apology fixed everything. Nothing could erase the hurt they had caused, but it was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate that," Malcolm said after a moment, his voice steady. "It means a lot to hear you say that, but it's not just about saying sorry, you know? It's about doing better, about treating people with respect moving forward." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "We will, Malcolm. We've learned a lot this semester, not just about math, but about life, about how we need to be better people." Ethan smiled, a bit sheepishly. "Yeah, and we owe a lot of that to you. You didn't have to help us, but you did. And that taught us a lot about the kind of person we want to be." The conversation shifted after that, becoming lighter again, as they talked about their summer plans, about the next year of school, and even about the possibility of doing something together over the break. For the first time in his life, Malcolm felt like he wasn't just tolerated, but genuinely included. It was a strange feeling, but a good one. A few days later, Malcolm was at home, sitting at the kitchen table when his mother came in, a proud smile on her face. "I heard you've been spending some time with Jason and Ethan," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "How's that been going?" Malcolm shrugged, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's been good. They've changed, I think. Or maybe we all have." Mrs. Davis sat down across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've always had a kind heart, Malcolm. I'm proud of you for giving them a chance, even after everything they put you through." Malcolm nodded, grateful for his mother's support. "I guess I just realized that holding on to all that anger wasn't helping anyone. People can change, Mom. I've seen it." His mother smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Yes, they can. And I'm so proud of the way you handled everything. It takes a strong person to offer forgiveness." Malcolm felt a warmth spread through him at his mother's words. She had always been his biggest supporter, and hearing her say that meant more to him than she could ever know. The summer passed quickly, and before Malcolm knew it, it was the first day of the new school year. As he walked through the familiar hallways, he couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The same students filled the halls, the same teachers stood at their doors, but for Malcolm, it was as if he was seeing everything through new eyes. He spotted Jason and Ethan near the lockers, laughing and talking with a group of students. When they saw him, they waved him over, smiling warmly. Malcolm hesitated for only a second before walking over to join them. "Hey, Malcolm," Jason greeted him, clapping him on the shoulder. "We were just talking about the school year. Ready to do it all over again?" Malcolm chuckled. "Yeah, I guess so. But this time, let's make sure you keep up with the work from the start, okay?" Ethan grinned. "No worries, man. We learned our lesson." As they talked and joked, Malcolm realized just how much things had changed. He wasn't the same shy, isolated student he had been at the start of the previous year. He had grown, not just academically, but emotionally. He had learned that kindness wasn't a weakness, that standing up for himself didn't mean shutting people out, and that forgiveness, though difficult, could open doors to unexpected friendships. The bell rang, and they headed to their first class together. The easy camaraderie between them, a far cry from the tension that had once defined their relationship. As they walked down the hall, Malcolm couldn't help but smile. He had started the year as the quiet, invisible genius, content to stay in the shadows. But now, he was something more. He was Malcolm Davis, the student who had not only aced the exam, but had also helped others along the way. He had earned his place, not through anger or resentment, but through kindness, patience, and the strength to see beyond the surface. As they entered the classroom, Malcolm felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was his new beginning, and he was ready to embrace it. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.